Continuing a reading of Brazen Chariots by Major Robert Crisp, the Ballantine 1961 paperback, page 17. My mind was occupied with two problems: how to get it near enough to the enemy and how to live long enough to get there. Obviously, armor plating was not enough protection. There were alarming stories going about of what the 88s could do to the massive turrets of the I-tanks, hitherto considered almost impenetrable. The only answer lay in mobility, and pretty fast mobility at that. At the same time, I completely discounted the possibility of shooting accurately from a moving tank, which was what we had all been taught to do when it was not possible to take up a hull-down position. So I worked out a system in my troop whereby, after the target had been indicated, a more or less automatic procedure followed if the circumstances were favorable. The objective was to get close enough to the enemy tank to be able to destroy it. The first order then was driver advance, flat out. The gunner would do his best to keep the cross wires of his telescopic sight on the target all the time we were moving. The next order heard by the gunner, driver, and loader would be driver halt. As soon as the tank stopped and he was on target, the gunner would fire without further command from me. The sound of the shot was the signal for the driver to let in his clutch and be off again. From stop to start, it took about 4 seconds. All I did was to control the movement and direction of the tank. The battle practiced convinced me that I was right, and that in tanks that were outgunned and out-armored, mobility was an essential element in survival. Needless to say, by mobility, I did not mean speed in the wrong direction. I did not win any competitions, but I had established to my own satisfaction that I could get in within the effective range of my own gun without the use of concealment and in a fairly aggressive manner. I put myself in the place of a man in the target, and thought it would be very disconcerting to have 4 tanks thundering down on top of you, all firing accurately, and none of them in one position long enough to be aimed at. I was hopeful that by using these tactics whenever the ground permitted, I would very much lessen the chances of being hit. It was not a substitute for the best battle position, which was hull down upon the ground of your own choosing, but I was quite certain that an overemphasis on the hull-down position in what was going to be a war of considerable movement was not a good thing. It tended to induce in tank commanders a hull-down mind, which was quite likely to develop into a turret-down mind. By great good fortune, on our return to Beni Yusuf from the firing range, I managed to get jaundice, and spent 2 weeks in the 15th General Hospital on the Nile opposite Gazira Island, eating boiled chicken and rice and watching the full-sailed dhows go by, while the battalion packed up laboriously and moved on westwards. It was the first major step toward the impending battle, and it took them to the Siwa track, south of Mersa Matruh. That is where I rejoined them. We were about 90 miles east of the wire, that fabulous entanglement that snaked rustily all along the border from the coast till it lost itself in the great dunes of the sand sea down in the south. It had been built by Mussolini's soldiers years before to keep out camels and itinerant Arabs who were inclined to regard the Libya-Egyptian frontier as a figment of Il Duce's imagination. Between strong points, the wire was patrolled very occasionally by the Italians on one side and almost constantly by the British on the other. There were some well-established breaches in a continuous state of demolition and repair. Here at Abara Canais, swarms of RAOC and RASC types descended on our tanks with metal tubing and rolls of Hessian. In a few days, they had transformed each regiment of tanks into what looked like a convoy of 3-ton lorries. In the dubious interests of security, these camouflage devices were known as sun shields. We were to keep them in position until the order was given to drop sun shields, by which time it was darkly hinted we would be well inside enemy territory. There is every reason to believe the deception was successful, and that Rommel had no idea that something like 600 tanks had been moved up within striking distance of his forces. It was in this guise that in the first week in November we moved up to a place called Halikat, south of the road running between Sidi Barani and Saloum. This was virtually the forming-up point for the brigade for the attack, which everybody knew was now imminent, though nobody knew when or where. From the march to Halikat there resulted one of those imperial flaps without which no British army has yet succeeded in entering a battle. The march from Canais to Halikat was made at night over what proved to be 80 miles of some of the most murderous going in the western desert. It was nearly all hard limestone outcrop, but the full extent of the damage to our tanks was not even suspected until daylight, when we had reached our destination. We then saw that the rubber blocks on the tracks of practically every honey in the brigade had been chewed to bits. General Gatehouse has since told me what happened when the full extent of this calamity became known. He reported the matter to John Harding, now Field Marshal Lord Harding, at Corps Headquarters, and was told to fly to Cairo with Exhibit A and see the Commander-in-Chief. The Gatehouse did, and got an immediate reaction from Auchinleck, who gave orders to strip the tracks off every honey in the rear areas and send them up immediately by rail to 4th Armored Brigade. The tattered tracks were to be sent back for repair if possible and use on training. He also decided that the brigade should be moved to a more suitable area by transporters. Such was the impetus behind these instructions that everything was carried out and completed in 3 days. This was our last but one stopping place before Operation Crusader started, and the last bit of leisure we would have for perfecting our fighting equipment and sending off our final messages of undying love and devotion. Here, too, we learnt for the first time the art of night loggering. Though it was a familiar enough blackboard diagram, it was a simple and effective maneuver for getting all tanks into a compact square, with the thin-skinned vehicles inside ready to fan out at first light into an offensive formation. We practiced loggering until we could do loggering blindfold, which was more or less the way we had to do it in the pitch dark of the desert night after disengagement from battle at last light. A rather odd thing happened to me at this time. I had been sent out in charge of a small recce party in a 1,500-weight truck to see what the going was like ahead of our area. We had come across a patch of soft sand in which the truck got stuck and needed a good deal of manhandling to get out. With 2 or 3 others, I was pushing and heaving at the back of the vehicle, cursing volubly as the wheel spun round, kicking up the desert into our eyes and ears, when there was a sudden, soft, fluttering noise in my ear, and I felt a light touch on my back. I took a casual glance from the corner of my eye and was amazed to see a pigeon sitting on my shoulder. Nobody else had noticed it, and as I stopped and straightened, I put my hand up slowly, expecting any second that the bird would take fright and fly off again. Instead, it seemed to come willingly into my hand, where it snuggled down contentedly. Only then did I notice the tube of white paper fastened to its leg by a piece of elastic. I called to the others. They gaped when they saw what I was holding and walked back towards me. I pointed to the piece of paper. "A carrier pigeon," said Henry McGrath. "How the hell did you get hold of that?" McGrath was an Australian troop commander in C Squadron. We had been in England and Greece together, and when his ancient tank had broken down somewhere in Macedonia, he had jumped on the back of mine with a few other bods. We were great friends. While I gently slid the elastic off the pigeon's leg, I told them what had happened. There was a strange air of unreality about the whole thing which impressed all of us. As far as I knew, we were 10 or 15 miles from the nearest British formation. There was nothing in sight except sand, rock, and scrub. What was this mysterious paper that had come fluttering down onto my shoulder from an empty sky above an empty land? A message from some remote patrol lost in the desert? Could it be a German carrier pigeon with a secret signal from the High Command? The others cloistered around, caught in the mystery of the moment, holding their breath while I unfolded the curled slip. It made a dry rustling sound that could have been heard 20 yards away. Slowly I opened it out until the penciled message lay revealed. It was in English and said simply, "Blank you, leave me alone." There was a moment of shocked incredulity, and then we burst into simultaneous roars. It was a good 10 minutes before we recovered enough to start pushing again. We discussed possibilities. The popular theory to which I subscribed was that it had come from our own technical sergeant. It was exactly the sort of thing he would do, and his LAD lorry, a great cavern of a thing filled with all the paraphernalia necessary for keeping a regiment of tanks on the move, became a sort of general depository for everything. Personally, I would not have been surprised if, somewhere in the deep recesses of that 10-tonner, he had a chase lounge and a couple of Jippo bints. A pigeon was really pretty insignificant stuff for the lad lorry. The tech sergeant denied all knowledge of the bird when I took it along to him, but I left it there. It seemed to settle in surprisingly quickly.